Okay, those are the validation controls in ASP.NET. They really give you a nice architecture for adding validation to your web forms and making sure the user's sending data to you that has been formatted properly. They perform both client-side and validation side, server-side validation. Server-side validation always happens, so you're guaranteed that that code is going to run, although do remember to check that is valid flag before you touch any of the data. 4 different validation controls available, plus a custom one that opens up a lot of doors. The summary control gives you a nice display of all of the errors on a page, either with a message box or just on a paragraph form with a list. And then finally, validation groups give us a way of enabling conditional validation depending on how the user is posting back the form. I'm sure I don't need to motivate validation in web applications for most of you. If you've done any development in web applications at all, I'm sure you've run into scenarios where you need to perform validation. And certainly there are plenty of examples of validation out on the web today, some of it better done than others, certainly. Anyway, so anytime a user enters data into your form and that data is going to be processed on the server, that is crying out for validation. You want to make sure that you're enforcing validation so that the user submits the right formatted data, that the user submits data at all, that the user enters 2 passwords that are matched, that the user has a phone number of the right format, etc. So there are many places where this shows up. Basically, anytime the user is entering data into a form and submitting it to your server, you are going to want to include some type of validation on that data. Now, the next slide, I just have an example of a form with a bunch of validation built into it to give us sort of an idea of the types of validation we might want to include in an application. So let's take a look at some of these. One of the simplest forms of validation is required field. So an example in the bottom here, I have a phone number which the user has neglected to populate, and when the user submits the field, we have an indicator adjacent to it saying something's wrong with this field, and we've also got a message up higher in this paragraph here describing the problem with that particular field. So we must fill in a phone number. Here's another example of validation you might enforce. This email address is obviously not properly formatted. It doesn't have the @ sign or the dot extension at the end, and you'd want to make sure that was enforced. And again, we're notifying the user of that in our list of problems on the current page. Another type of validation you'll often want to enforce is comparing 2 fields. So if you're having the user enter a password, for example, and you want to make sure they're both the same, you want to check the value of each field before you allow the user to submit the form. So those are just a few samples of the types of validation you might want to enforce. And what we're going to do is look at how you can include these validation types in your applications using ASP.NET validation controls. There are 2 places you can enforce validation. You can do it on the client with some client-side JavaScript, or you can do it on the server, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And they usually go hand in hand. In fact, they should always go hand in hand. You want to make sure that you never rely exclusively on client-side validation just because there are too many different ways of bypassing client-side script if you want to. But it definitely should be done in most cases. Adding client-side validation with JavaScript will potentially reduce the number of round trips for the user, so it makes it a better experience for the client, just because instead of having to post the entire page back to the server to see what was wrong in their page, they can see it immediately as you notify them with JavaScript notifications. It does require some client browser support for scripting, although these days that's pretty commonplace, so you're usually fairly safe incorporating client-side validation. But I do want to emphasize that it is always easy to subvert these types of things. So make sure you never rely exclusively on client-side validation if you're trying to enforce some sort of data format. So let's take a quick look at how you might perform client-side validation. And what I have here is it's an ASP.NET website, but the page I'm looking at right now is a simple HTML page. So we're not talking about anything specific to ASP.NET right now. And I just want to show you a particular technique for implementing client-side validation. And it turns out this technique is essentially the one that is used by ASP.NET, so it'll be useful to understand how this works. So here's the idea. We have a form that the user is going to submit to us, an HTML form, and it has some input elements inside of it, including a name as well as an email address here, input email. And in order to, what I'm going to do in this example is just enforce required field validators on each of these input elements. So I want to make sure the user has entered a customer name and has entered an email. So to do that, I'm going to include a span element adjacent to each of these fields with an error message inside of it. So please enter a name here, please enter an email here, and I'm going to set the style of that span initially to have a visibility of hidden, and we'll also mark the text in red so it stands out when we need to show it. So when the form first displays, the client will not see these error messages because they're going to be hidden. And then what happens is when the form is submitted, we return a call to a client-side function called checkForm, which I have written just above. And by returning the result of this, if this returns true, then the form will be submitted. But if it returns false, that will prevent the submission of the form and force the user to correct the errors before we can really submit. So here's what that checkForm function looks like. We're going to set the default value of this to false, so we assume the worst. And then we just reach into the DOM, look at the name element and see if it has any content inside of it. And if it doesn't, we're going to flag it by setting the visibility of that span style visibility to true, or to visible. So that'll turn that span on and you can see it. Similarly, if the email field is missing, we're going to set that span's visibility to true. If both of them have content, we'll go ahead and set return to true. So let's go ahead and run this page, get a sense for what it's going to look like. So if I don't put any elements in here, notice the name is not filled in. And let's try pressing again, and this time we get the email address. Now obviously I could use some work here to clean this up, but I just want to show you the mechanics of performing client-side validation. And that's sort of the basics of how most validation systems are going to work. Whether or not you include client-side validation in your forms, you should always include server-side validation. Before you touch any data that is submitted by a user, make sure it's of the right format and it doesn't include any embedded script that you might be representing to the clients, or any number of reasons you want to make sure you enforce server-side validation. And again, even if you are using client-side validation, server-side validation is still necessary because there are any number of ways of bypassing client-side validation, even if you have it turned on. If you do get an error when you're doing server-side processing, the typical response is to simply post the page back to the server with some error indicators on the page and give the user a chance to correct the problem. So I have an example here we can take a look at of server-side validation. Pretty similar to the example I was showing you earlier with the client-side, but now we're working with ASP.NET server-side controls, and all of the interaction with the content is going to be done on the server. So I've got a couple of fields here, a name text box and an email text box, and what I've done to prepare for validation is place a couple of labels adjacent to those two fields, and I've set them initially with no text. So we're going to set the text on those labels if and when we encounter an error on the server-side processing. So the handler for the button is going to look something like this. And you can see how this is going to get rather verbose pretty quickly. So we're going to check to see if the name text box has any content, and if it does not, we're going to populate the error label adjacent to that text box with an error message. Otherwise, we'll make sure it's empty. Similarly, we'll check the email text box, and if there's nothing there, we'll make sure that it's the error message is displayed. And then at the very bottom, if there is content in both of these boxes, so we're enforcing required field validation on both, then we can safely use the data. Now this is very minimal checking. I'm just verifying that there is content, doing a required field check, but you would obviously expand this to perform format checking and any other type of validation you wanted to enforce. So let's go ahead and try running that. So if I press enter now, notice my two error messages show up because I didn't populate the fields. If I put a value in the name field, we only get the error message for the email. And if I do the email, then everything looks fine. So what have we learned in our quick tour of validation in web applications so far? First of all, error messages often appear adjacent to the input elements that are causing the problem, so that's a useful feature to keep in mind. It's nice to have a list of all the errors on the page somewhere so that the user can easily identify what the problems are and then work to address them. Client-side validation is useful for avoiding round trips and making a better client experience, although not to be relied on exclusively for validation because of the potential for bypassing it. Server-side validation on any client input should always happen, regardless of what's happening on the client. Error messages for a given field, I'm not sure we actually encounter this, but it's an important one to think about. Imagine the user not typing in an email field, and then you should get a certain message, please enter an email. And then if he types one in, but it's the wrong format, you might want to change the message. So it might be nice to have a way of displaying a different error message for a given field depending on what the actual error is. And we talked about various types of validation, including cross-control validation, cross-field validation, comparing two values, among other things. So all of these features are features that would be nice to have as part of a validation system, and it turns out all of these features are included in the ASP.NET validation controls. So ASP.NET provides a framework for performing validation in your pages. It's a set of validation controls, and there's support at the page level as well, as we'll see. And it addresses all those observations we had on the previous page through various controls and other features, as we'll see. And the way you work with ASP.NET validation is by adding one or more validation controls to your page. And these validation controls will enforce validation on a particular control on the page. So typically you would associate one with another text box element, for example. It supports the displaying of a message box, a pop-up box if you want to, and or a summary paragraph of all the problems on the page. It performs client-side validation implicitly when it's possible, when the client has support for it. And it always performs server-side validation. So one of the nice things about these controls is you don't really have to go through the process of deciding when and where to provide client-side versus server-side validation. It happens regardless of which controls you use. That all these controls perform both server-side as well as client-side validation. So let's take a look at adding a validation control to a form. I'm going to jump back to our demonstration code here, and let's bring up a page that I have ready to go that does not yet have any validation on it. Okay, and just to give you a sense for what this page is going to do, let me go ahead and run the application. So we are collecting data from the user, getting a name, an age, an email, and a couple of a password with a validation. And if the user enters the data or does not enter the data and presses enter, we shouldn't get to this page, but we currently are. So we're going to a secondary page and displaying the information that the user entered, which in this case obviously is nothing. So let's go ahead and try adding a validation control to this page here. And I'm going to add one for the name text box element. So I want to enforce or force the user to enter a valid name. Now you'll find the validation controls on your toolbox here in a separate section. And the one I'm going to be trying right now is the required field validator that will enforce that a value is actually entered in a specific field. And let's call this the name validator. And inside of here, what we need to do is now associate this control, this validation control, with this text box. And actually, I want to move this into the cell just adjacent to it so we get that relationship going on. Okay, now to create the association, we're going to set the control to validate property, which you can see down in the properties window here. We're going to set that equal to the control that we want to enforce the validation on. So I'm going to go select this guy, and in here we'll type the identifier of the text box we want to validate, so name text box. And notice that just sets the control to validate property on that control. Now there are two other important things you want to do here. One is you typically want to set the error message, and the error message is one that's going to be extracted by the validation summary control that we'll take a look at in a moment. So for now, I'm just going to put in an error message here. Usually you want to make this somewhat descriptive, so please enter a name maybe. And then the other piece of text that you can add to these controls that will not be included by default is the text property, which you can also populate with the inner content of the control. And here, this is what's going to show up immediately adjacent to the control. So I often like to put in just a couple of asterisks to indicate that there's a problem with that particular field. Okay, and that's the extent of it. Once you have a validation control pointing to another control, it will enforce its validation on both the client and the server, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But let's just verify we're getting the behavior we expect. So if I try to submit the form now without entering a name, notice the error indicator showed up immediately adjacent to the form. Now we don't have the paragraph of errors. We'll take care of that in just a moment, but at least we're getting the validation. And notice that I'm not getting, there was no postback. So this was actually client-side validation. Right? If we add the field, it works fine. But if we go back here and we don't add anything, we press enter, there is no postback. So all of that validation is currently happening on the client, which is nice. Now, anytime you are using validation controls on a page, you typically will also want to include a validation summary control. The validation summary control will harvest all of the error messages from all of the validation controls on the page that have failed validation and display them in either a message box and or a paragraph. And this will give the user a nice succinct description of all the problems on the page and hopefully make it easier to rectify the issues. So let's go ahead and try adding a validation summary to our page so we can see that error message first of all. Now you can place this wherever you want to. I'm just going to put mine outside of the table where I'm collecting data. Drop the validation summary control onto the page. Now you don't actually need to wire it up to anything because the validation summary control is aware of all of the validation controls on the page and will harvest all of the error messages without having to without you having to associate them. So VS control. Now let's change a couple of properties here. One is let's set the show message box to true, so we'll actually pop up a little message box when an error fails, validation fails. And let's also change the display mode from the default of list to a bulleted list. So we'll have little indicators next to each item that is causing a problem. And let's go ahead and try running that. So we currently only have one validation control on the form, so it's the name validation control. But if I press enter, notice we're now getting an alert box that describes the name, describes the problem, and I'm also getting this list of problems down here. Now the other thing you probably want to include with the validation summary control is a piece of header text, and that will put a title in both the message box and that paragraph or bulleted list for you. So you might want to do something like, please correct these errors, and let the user know that something needs to be done before they can continue. So now we have a nice description of what's going on, and our paragraph or bulleted list has a header with a string attached to it. So you should typically include a validation summary control if you're going to be using any of the validation controls in ASP.NET. One thing you might be wondering at this point is what the validation controls actually render as when they're sent back to the client. And it should come as no surprise that they actually render as span elements, as you see here. So this is an example of a required field validator, and we have all those properties set like we've been looking at. And this will render to the client, as you see down below here, as a span, very similar to the approach that I showed you earlier with an HTML span that we toggled the visibility of. And in fact, if you look at the style attribute, it's set initially to a color of red and a visibility of hidden. There already is a control, by the way, in ASP.NET that renders a span as for its implementation, which is the label control. And in fact, this control, all the validation controls inherit from the label control, so they get their rendering capabilities inherited from label. Now, the one other thing that you might find useful to know is there's a display property on the validation controls, all of them have it, And the display property will control how the style attribute for the span is rendered to the client. If you leave it at static, which is the default, it's going to render with a visibility of hidden for the style, which means it will continue to occupy space even when nothing is when the span is not rendered. The other option is to mark it as display equals dynamic, as I have on the right here, and this will set the display attribute of the style for the span to none, and that will not occupy space. Now you might wonder, why would I care? At what point would I make a decision between those two? Let me show you an example where it actually would make a difference. So I have our sample here with a required field validator on the name element. Let's add another validation control that is going to apply to the name element. And I'm going to use one that we haven't looked at yet, but it's pretty straightforward. It's called the compare validator. And one of the things the compare validator lets you do is compare the value of an input element, like a text box, with a string, if you just want a hardcode test. So we can use that as a basis for trying this out. Let's call this the name compare validator. And I'm going to set the error message equal to please enter the name Bob. Kind of a silly enforcement here, but I'm actually going to require people to enter a name of Bob. I'm going to set the control to validate equal to the name text box. And I'm going to set the value to compare equal to the string Bob. So this validation control is going to make sure the user types in the name Bob into the name text box. And I'm also going to place the same text that we had in the other validation control. So we have the same appearance when there's a validation failure. Now if we go ahead and run this and try submitting an empty form, we'll get the error indicator like we did before. But what I want you to do is watch those two asterisks on the side. What happens when I enter a name that is not Bob and I submit the form? Notice they moved, so we're getting some overlap there, and because the other one actually occupies space even when it's not being displayed, we get this offset behavior, which you probably don't want. That's feels kind of cluttery and it's not really clean. So what we can do is set the display property on each of these validation controls to dynamic, and that should keep it looking the same regardless of which validation control actually fired. So let's try running that again. I press enter and we get the validation failure. I type in a name that's not Bob and we press enter again and we get the same error indicator. Let's start looking at how this validation actually occurs now, and specifically I want to focus on the server-side validation that is happening sort of without even our noticing it. The way this works is the page class manages the validation that happens on the server, and it does so by maintaining a collection of validation controls. It's got a collection called validators in the page class, and each validation control implements this iValidator interface, and that interface is what the page will use to perform the server-side validation. It'll actually invoke this method right here called validate to execute the validation. And we'll talk about when that happens and how it intersects with the rest of the lifecycle in a moment. But what you need to know about this is the page will expose an isValid property, or does expose an isValid property, and that is essentially the intersection of all the isValid properties on the controls that it has in its collection. So you can very quickly check on the server to see if all of the validation controls have passed validation by looking at the isValid property on the page class. Also, if for some reason you need to invoke validation yourself, you can call validate on the page itself, and that will iteratively invoke the validate method of every validation control that is part of that page. So those are the members that are involved with the server-side validation. Now, what's important for you to understand about server-side validation is that unless you take the initiative to actually look to see if the controls are invalid, you will not notice that anything is wrong. So it's not like it will stop server-side processing if validation fails. All that happens is that isValid flag is going to be set to false. So you need to be proactive about this. And if you include validation controls on your page, make sure you check the isValid flag. So let me go show you an example of where this could throw you off if you're not careful. So I have my page here that's doing the validation. And right now, client-side validation is kicking in. So we never actually get a post back to the server, and we never have a need to perform, well, we never detect that anything goes wrong in the server because we never get data. But if I disable client-side validation, which I can do by telling this page to pretend that it's an unrecognized browser making the request by setting client target equal to down level, okay, that will disable client-side validation, and it will rely only on server-side validation. Now the problem with this page is, if you look at my code behind, when the user presses that button, I go about collecting the data from my various input elements, and then I transfer control to another page. So if we run this, and I just press enter without performing any checks or entering any data, notice I was sent to the other page with no validation, or it seemed to be there's no validation being enforced. Now it turns out validation was being enforced, but I was never looking for it. So again, if you are using validation controls, make sure before you look at any of your server-side data that make sure you check to see if the page is valid. So this .isValid. So if we are valid, then we go about doing our server-side processing of the input elements the user typed in, and then maybe doing a transfer to another page. Otherwise, we're just going to fall through and let the page re-render its contents with all of the error messages in place. And you'll get the equivalent of the error messages that we had in the client, but this time they'll be generated by the server. So that's the behavior you want, and just keep that in mind to check the isValid flag. A lot of people aren't aware of this because they never see their client-side validation disabled. So it's always a good idea to try this on pages that are using validation to see if all your logic behaves properly in the context of no client-side validation. So we've seen how validation happens on the server. We haven't actually discussed when it happens, though, during the request processing sequence of a particular page. And that's what this slide is going to show us. It shows us that the validate method is going to be called at this location in the page sequence. And notice what's happening before we get here is we have all these other events taking place all the way up to the load event of the page class. And this is another common scenario, another common issue that people often run into, which is if you're in the load event and you try to look at data that was sent back by the user, it will not have gone through the validation sequence yet. So you either need to look at it later on in the life cycle, which is what we were doing, looking at it during a server-side event being fired, or you'll need to take it into your own hands and actually initiate the validation before you look at your control data. So let me show you an example of that. If I'm in my page here that we've been looking at, and I'm inside of my page load handler, and if it's a post back, then we know the data is being processed here. But what you don't want to do is check the isValid flag here because it will not have been validated yet. So if I do something like this.isValid, and then I go about and use the data here, this will actually generate an exception. So if we run this, as you'll see, do the post on the server. Oops, I need to disable my client-side validation. So let's put that back in. Okay, so let's go try posting the empty fields again. Okay, notice we got an exception because I tried to check for the validation control before validation had actually occurred. So if you do find the need to do this, if you find the need to verify your data is valid inside of your load event handler, most common place to want to look for it, before you check is valid, just run the validation function. So you just say this.validate, and that will manually run through the validation process, and then you can safely check to see if the isValid flag is set to true or false. Okay, so there we go. Same behavior as before. So keep that in mind, that validation happens immediately after the load event of a page class. And if you want to access data to see if the data is valid before that, you're going to have to manually call the validate method yourself before checking is valid. So that's how server-side validation works. Now, client-side validation is a different story. This has to happen all inside of the client browser. It's run via JavaScript, and it needs to interact dynamically with events that happen as the user navigates around the page. So the first thing to know about client-side validation is there's a support script file that is brought into your page called webuivalidation.js. And this is read as a resource from the system.webassembly and pulled into your page anytime you use any of the validation controls. And as we'll see, this has a number of client-side JavaScript methods or functions defined in it that aid in the client-side validation. Then the other piece of the picture is each validation control renders as a span element, as we've seen, and that span element has an identifier that's going to be referenced by many of these client-side functions to dynamically toggle the visibility of those spans, using a technique very similar to the technique I showed you earlier with our raw client-side validation example. Now, a couple other pieces that are worth noting. Your page will have a global page validators variable defined in it. And this is going to be set up with all of these span elements that correspond to the validation controls defined on your page. There's a validator onload method that's going to be added to your page, which will wire up event handlers to various functions that are defined. And as I showed you earlier, you can disable the client-side validation for testing purposes by setting the client target attribute in your page directive to down level. Now, let me just show you a few of these pieces in our running application so you can get a sense for what's out there. If you want to look at the JavaScript in your that's dropped into your page, here's a technique you can use for seeing all the script files. Go ahead and run it in debug mode. Start debugging. And before you run, make sure you go into the Internet options for IE and uncheck this flag right here, the disable script debugging for Internet Explorer, and that will enable script debugging in IE, and it also enables this viewer, which lets you see all the script files that have been loaded into your page. So if we look at the source code for the page, you'll begin to see some of the scripts that were dropped in here. Here's a reference to a script file that was pulled in, and if you go back to your Visual Studio running in debug mode, you'll see that script file being displayed right here underneath the script documents while you're running. And if you open that up, this is the script UI file that I was telling you about that has all of these helper methods that are referenced by the various functions that are going to be added to your page. So that's where those are defined. And then the rest of the page, of your page, has some client-side script involved here to get things rolling. So it's got a web form on submit, which is a function that will perform the validation whenever you try to submit the form. And if we scroll down here a ways towards the bottom, you'll see a bunch of other pieces of script that were injected, including that page level variable called validation summary, or validators rather. That's the collection of validation controls, the span elements. And then here you see the actual creation of those controls with all their properties set, and they are going to be added to that validators array. And then down here we have a wire up for the validator onload event, wiring it up to a function, and here's the definition for that validator on submit. So a bunch of JavaScript is added to your page specific to the controls that you have defined on your page, and this JavaScript file is also referenced for including all of the helper functions that complete the implementation of the client-side validation. Now, one other thing that's worth pointing out here is the client-side validation is going to happen either when you submit the page, that's going to be hijacked in the form submit event, or anytime you lose focus, you tab out of one of the fields on your form. So if I type in Bob here and tab to the next field, notice that validation error goes away. So that's another thing that needs to be hooked into and wired up when your page gets run. So here's a quick guide for you if you want to go poking around these client-side script functions and how they interact with your controls. We have that global array, the validators array. There's also a global pages valid boolean, which you're welcome to check anytime you want to in your client-side code. When the entire form loads, it's going to call the validator onLoad, which will iterate across all the validation controls and hook up the event handlers for the change notifications. When the submit button is called, it's going to call this client validate that goes across all the validators and invokes a client-side method to execute their validation algorithm. And then we also have this validator on change event. Anytime you lose focus in one of these fields, it'll invoke this change event, and that will also perform the validation. So you can hook into some of those if you want to, but the good news is it all just works without you having to deal with any of the details. The only examples I've shown you so far of using validation controls were applying them to text boxes. And that's by far the most common thing to apply validation controls to. You see it in the list down here. Just because that's where the user can enter data and you're going to process the data, and you need to make sure it is the right format. There are other controls, however, that you can apply validation controls to. And you see the list down here of all those controls that support validation controls. So there are a number of HTML controls that support it. The input control, text area, select an input file. And then there are a couple other ASP.NET server-side controls that support it as well. The drop-down list, list box, and radio button list. All of those can be used in conjunction with validation controls. Now, one of the things that must be true for these controls to work with validation controls is that they must have a server-side validation property attribute to tell it which property should be inspected for validation. And then the client-side value attribute must also correspond to the value that should be validated. And you'll notice that there is a control that doesn't have these two properties, either server-side or client-side, and is therefore not listed down here, and that is the checkbox control. So unfortunately, the checkbox did not fit into the control validation model, so there is no support out of the box for validating checkboxes. So what else can you do in terms of validation with these controls? Well, there are 5 built-in controls in ASP.NET. The one we've been looking at so far is the required field validator that just ensures that a field is not empty. And I briefly showed you the compare validator, and I used it to compare against a fixed constant value, but you can also use that to compare against another field for doing, say, cross-password comparison. There's a range validator, which lets you check to see whether a value entered is within a certain range, and it could be a numeric value, it could be a date value, it could be a currency value, etc. There's also a regular expression validator. This is probably one of the most useful ones because you can put in an arbitrary regular expression, and whatever the user enters must pass that regular expression to be considered valid. And then finally, if none of these fits the bill, there's also a custom validator where you supply your own functions for validation, both server-side and client-side if you want to, and it will just be validated at the same point in time when all the other validation controls are firing, and it lets you decide how the validation should work. And of course, we saw the validation summary control take place earlier. One thing I would like to point out about these controls here is the required field validator. By default, and all these other controls, all 4 of these here, will accept an empty field as a valid value. So if you want to make sure that someone enters something and that something adheres to a regular expression or falls within a range, you must include both a required field and one of these 4 to enforce those two. Because if you just use one of these 4, all of these will always let an empty value just pass through. So make sure you keep that in mind. Let's take a look at the compare validator control. So this control lets you compare the contents of another control, typically a text box, to either a constant value or to the contents of another control. So the example I'm showing on the slide here, we're using the value to compare property of the compare validator. We're telling it we want to compare it as an integer. So we're going to ask the validation control to parse the contents of this text box up here as an integer before performing the comparison. And then we're performing a greater than or equal to comparison to see if the person looking at this page is greater than or equal to 21 in age. So a couple things to note about this. There are various operators you can use to compare: greater than or equal to, less than, etc. You can use value to compare or control to compare, depending on whether you want to compare a constant or the contents of another control. And you can also specify the type. What do you want it to parse the contents to before you perform the comparison? So let's go ahead and try this one out. We have a candidate for a compare validator already on our page here with the 2 password fields. So what I'm going to do is place a compare validator in the second of the 2 password fields to make sure that it matches whatever was typed into the first password field. So we'll toss in that guy right here. And just like all of our other controls, let's set the text equal to a couple of asterisks, and we'll set the error message to something descriptive. Please enter passwords that match. And finally, we're going to set the control to validate equal to the text box right there, the re-enter password text box. And I'm going to set the control to compare equal to the password text box, which is just above me. And then we also need to set the type of comparison. So the type is going to be just a string. Notice all the type options we have here: date, currency, double integer, string. And finally, the operator that we're going to use is going to be equal. Again, notice all the options you have here. We just want to make sure that those 2 fields are in fact equal. So that should enforce that the 2 password fields that are typed in here contain the same values, and it's going to happen both on the client and on the server, just like all validation controls do. So we're guaranteed it'll happen in both places. So let's try this out. If I put in something here and they don't match, we get that error message here that the passwords must match. So let's try something different and make sure they do match. Okay, now we're just down to enter a name, and once we fill in a name, whoops, I know that has to be Bob at this point, right? We can go on to our secondary page. Okay, so the compare validator can be quite useful, either comparing against a constant or against another field. As I mentioned before, one of the most useful validation controls in this collection is the regular expression validation control. And that's just because it has so much flexibility. So you can use this regular expression validator to verify the contents of an input element match a particular regular expression. So this would be used for things like telephone numbers or email addresses, anything that has a specific format that you want to perform some validation against. The validation expression is where you place your regular expression, and there's a really good documentation page on the MSDN website for the regular expression validator control that shows you all of the syntax for the regular expressions that are supported. So if you're not familiar with regular expressions, I encourage you to check that out and make sure you compare with someone else before you start using regular expressions to guarantee that it does what you think it does, because they're notoriously tricky to get right. So let's go try out the regular expression validator. Now we have another candidate for use here in our email field. What I want to do is make sure the user has entered a valid email. So let's go ahead and drop the regular expression validator into that adjacent field, and we'll set the error message equal to please enter an email of the form cindy@yahoo.com. And let's change this to email regex validator for the identifier. And finally, we'll set the text equal to a couple of asterisks like we've been doing. Now, I could go ahead and type in the regular expression here, but there's actually a nice feature inside of Visual Studio which has a bunch of pre-built regular expressions. If you go to the designer and get the properties on this regular expression validation control, you have a little ellipsis here that lets you choose from a number of prefabricated regular expressions for common scenarios. And in fact, the one I'm interested in here is in fact an email address, so I'll just grab that guy, drop it in, and now we should have enforcement for email regular expression guarantee. Of course, you do need to tell it which control to validate, which means I need to set control to validate equal to email text box. Okay, that should do it. And now if we type in a good name, a good password, whoops, there's a good name, and then a bogus email, notice we try to submit and it says, please enter that correct format, and not until we actually meet the constraints of that format does the validation actually pass and let us continue. The last validation control I want to show you is the custom validator control. And this is one you can reach for if none of the other ones quite fit the bill. And I've often seen this used in applications where you want to perform some sort of business logic check on the server. And obviously that's not going to be something you can just use from one of the pre-built ones. And this is a great way to do that. So just throw a custom validator on there, add a server validate function, and you know that's going to be called every time that page is processing a postback immediately after the load event. So let me just jump to an example here. I have one already built we can take a look at to give you a sense for how to use the custom validator control. Now, when you're working with a custom validator, you can either choose to include client-side validation or not. It's entirely up to you. It works fine if you only use server-side validation. So let me start with how that works, because that's probably going to be the most common thing you'll want to do. Now, what I'm going to do is validate a text box here, and I'm going to validate it to check to see if the user has entered a number that is divisible by 3. So I'm just going to do a modulus on 3 for something simple. So here's how you specify your function. You just tell it what the name of the function is on the server, make sure that's part of your class definition, your page class definition, and I've defined that inside of my code behind page here. So here's my server validation function where I'm going to perform the validation, and this is going to be called during the page lifecycle right after load during a postback. And what you want to do in here is set the isValid flag of this event args that's coming into you to true if it's a successful validation. Otherwise, you want to set it to false. And the value you're going to be looking at is passed in through the value property of that event args. So you deal exclusively with this event args. You look at the value and then you set the isValid property to true or false. And then inside of here, do whatever you want to perform the validation. You could actually go look against the database if you wanted to, or you could do some sort of complex calculation. In my case, I'm just trying to convert it to an integer, make sure that works. If it doesn't work, I'm going to fall through and just let the exception get caught and not propagate, because if it's not a number, I just want to return false. It did not succeed. Okay, if it is a number, then I will continue here. I check the modulus of the number with 3, and if the answer is 0, it's divisible by 3. So I'm going to set the isValid flag to true, and that will perform the validation. So that's it for custom validators on the server validation. Now, if you want to, and you have the ability to, you can also provide a client validation function, just like all the other controls have. So I've provided that here as well because it's easy enough to write a modulus check inside of JavaScript. So I've just added this function to the top of my page here inside of a script block. And notice this, the syntax is pretty much the same. It takes a source and an args pair of parameters, and the args parameter has a value property that contains the text field value you're doing the validation on, and it's got an isValid flag you need to set either to true or false. So in JavaScript, I just check the modulus with 3, and if that works, I set it to true, or if it's non-zero, I set it to true, and if it's if it's non-zero, I set it to false, and if it's 0, I set it to true. Okay, so let's go ahead and try running this. See what happens when I type in a number that is not divisible by 3. So I get my little error message here. And if I put in 3, that's fine. If I put in 9, that's fine. If I put in 44, not so good. Okay, so relatively easy to tap into the validation control system without building a custom validation control, just by using this custom validator. Now there's one more feature I want to tell you about with respect to the validation controls in ASP.NET, and that is validation groups. And this is a feature that was added in the 2.0 release of ASP.NET. And it solves the problem of having a page with multiple ways of submitting. So imagine you have 2 or 3 different buttons on the page, each of which performs a different type of submit. You may not want all of your validation controls to run if the user is pressing one of the buttons and not the other one. So the way this works is you can define a validation group, and you just add this as a property to all of your validation controls and set that property equal to some string, some name, which you will then also associate with a postback control like a button. So you just set this validation group property to some string that is the same across all the controls you want to include in the group, and then go in and add the same property to one of your postback controls like a link button or a standard button. And then when that link button or standard button does a postback, it will run the validation algorithms for all of those validation controls that are within that group and not run any of the others. There's also programmatic support for these. You can do a page validate on the server by passing in the group name to be selective about which set of controls you want to perform validation on. And you can also check the isValid, which will evaluate the validation group postback. So let's go, let me show you an example of this. I have another website that I'm going to bring up here that uses the validation groups that we can take a look at. So I'll open this up and let me just show you the behavior. Let's start with the way this runs so you can get a sense for what you can do with this. So here's the idea. I want the user to be able to enter his or her name, gender, and email address. And then I have 2 different ways of posting the form. One is the sign up, which is going to require all of the fields to be entered. And the other one is sign up with name only, which only requires the first 2 fields. So in order for that to work, what I had to do was create a couple of groups inside of my validation controls. So notice that each of my validation controls here, the required field validator, has in it a validation group. And what I've done down at the bottom, so that's the sign up group, what I've done at the bottom is in my button, the sign up button, I've also associated the validation group property with that control so it knows which validation controls to fire when this button is pressed. And then the other button is the sign up with name only, and this guy belongs to the name only validation group. And you'll notice up above here I have a number of validation controls that belong to the name only validation group. Now if you do elect to use the validation groups, it's important to note that only controls that belong to the validation group of the postback element are going to be fired. So if I go down here and notice that this button here belongs to the sign up validation group, that's going to fire only the validation controls that belong to that group. So it's not going to fire validation controls that don't belong to any group. So one of the things you do need to do in a lot of cases is you need to have multiple validation controls that are essentially redundant so that they fire when each of the respective postback controls generates a postback. So in this case, I want the first name to be required for both sign up and sign up with name only. And to do that, I have to add 2 validation controls with essentially the same properties, except that the second one contains the name only validation group and the first one contains the sign up validation group. So that can be useful if you're trying to be more granular about your validation and you have multiple ways of posting the page back. Hi, this is Fritz Onion from Pluralsight, and in this module we're going to be taking a look at validation in ASP.NET. Specifically, we're going to talk about validation in general in web applications, looking at both client-side validation using JavaScript and server-side validation. Then we'll take a look at the validation architecture that ASP.NET provides for us and how to use it, use the basics. So adding validation to a form, how it adds client-side validation to your application, and how it enforces server-side validation as well. And then we'll spend some time looking at each of the various validation controls that are available, talk about when and where you might want to apply them, and some of the restrictions that are involved with them. And we'll also take a look at doing custom validation if none of the existing controls meets your needs. And we'll finish up with a look at validation groups, which is a way of conditionally enforcing subsets of your validation controls depending on which button actually initiated the post back for the page.